Here we're going to have a look at what we've called loading phase. So loading is essentially where the front foot is pronating. So for simplicity purposes, we've asked, does the hip hike, does it drop, or it doesn't move? So we're referencing this to the front foot. Now, as we can see here on this runner, we do see as he loads into that front foot, the hip hike. But as we're going to see here, it is much more complex than that. This whole phase of gait is all about loading the body weight towards the front foot. So ideally, what we want to see here as we load into the front foot is the same side shoulder also drop. That means we're bringing our center of mass towards that front foot, which we're going to need as we start to then bring our weight onto the front foot in preparation to lift that back leg. Now this, whilst we see the hip hike here, there's a few things that aren't ideal. One is that the hip is already shifted over to the right anyway. So ideally, as we see the hip hike, we consider it to be what we call an on-axis movement. So we consider we're standing still and imagine your belly button as the center of this movement. And as we hiked and dropped the hips, the belly button would shift across to the side. Here we can see the hips are already shifted across to the right. So it's not necessarily what we'd call an on-axis movement. Whilst we do see that hip hike, we actually see him lean away from the hip or from the foot. So essentially that hip moving to the right, rather than bringing the whole mass towards that right foot, we're actually just bringing the hip across. And if we look at we spoke about this strike phase, how important that is for preparation. As we load in, we can see the foot, even before it has bore the weight of the body, we can already see it's in an everted position. If we're landing everted, it's impossible to pronate. We can't pronate on a foot that is already in essentially what we would call a pronated position. So there's no real pronation happening here, which is important for allowing muscles such as the glutes to decelerate the continuing movement here, and again set up for the following phases. So we can see here, we see this position here, we can refer to this as already being in an everted position. So we can probably argue that is part of the reason why we're not seeing the optimal positions happening in the hip here, while we have this leaning away rather than leaning towards the front foot. So whilst we do see the hip hike here, this isn't an ideal position in terms of our pronation patterns. If we keep in mind what we're looking for here is ideally the front foot pronating, it's worth looking at the foot itself. So we would hope as the weight comes into the foot, we have 3 points of contact on the feet: heel, lateral, medial contact of the front of the foot. And loading into this, we should see some pronation. Now, some of the strategies we can see in this runner here, searching for the ground here with this toe, almost as though the foot instinctively knows it needs to pronate, but her foot just isn't really moving into a good pronated position. So we often will also, as we look at the foot, see strategies like this. We might see toes gripping, any number of things that are happening as a result of pronation mechanics not quite doing what they should do. Here again, just looking at some of the subtleties around when we're looking at this hip hiking. On first view, we would look as we load into this left foot here, we do see this hip hiking. But if we really pay attention to the point at which all that weight is borne on that front foot, we could see the hip really, it probably is returning to neutral more than it's hiking. And if we look at the weight of the body here, we can see at the right shoulder dropped here. So we can actually see that this runner is leaning away from that front leg. We can see that she hasn't really let all her weight transition into that front foot. We can also instinctively, you can probably see this yourself, as a result of that shoulder dropping and that hip moving out to the left, there's quite a bit of weight on the outside edge of her foot. So rather than pronating, she's left her weight on the outside edge of that left foot. So as mentioned, we can see the hips hike side to side in this runner. As she walks through, we see what looks like quite nice movement through her pelvis on first glance. But we also need to tie it into all the other things that are happening, because really when we look at pronation, it's a whole body action. It's not just what happens at the foot, it's how this force is distributed through the whole chain, from the leg all the way up through to the head, and even considering what happens in terms of arm swing as well. And just quickly, one more to look at here. So as this runner loads into his front foot, we don't really see much movement at the hip. We see this compensated for in the upper body. So he's trying to get his weight over this front leg, and we see how the whole right shoulder drops. And interestingly, we also see movement at the head here. We can see that the right ear has moved towards the right shoulder. So he's laterally flexed both through his upper body as well as through his neck. We can see really everything dropping to that right. When we compare this to the left, we do see a little bit more movement in the hips, not a huge amount, there's not really that much going on, but we see that left shoulder drop, and we see now how it straightens up his body. He tends to have his eyes now more level, looking straight ahead, compared with as he looks to try and find pronation on the right, this whole lateral flexion, looking at this distance between his ears and his shoulder side to side, and we can see that he is more leaning towards the right here. So it's worth considering, whilst we've simplified this a lot and we've asked you what is happening at your hips, we want to consider all of these strategies that you are looking at in order to try and bring that weight over that front foot and pronate the front foot.